Eric? Routine proceedings. Dépôt de documents.
Tabling of documents.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 36.8a, I have the honor to table in both official languages the government's responses to 10 petitions. These returns will be tabled in electronic format. And while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, I would move, seconded by the member for Sudbury, that the House do now proceed to orders of the day.
So, Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Madame Lapointe, moved that the House do now proceed to orders of the day. If a participating member in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes for the request for recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair. L'honorable député de Salaberry.
The honourable member for Salaberry-sur-Loire.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Recorded vote, Mr. Speaker.
Call in the members.
Hey everybody, it looks like we're stuck waiting for a vote call, which is that's convenient. The moment it starts, the Liberals ask for a vote to move to orders of the day. For those of you new to the channel or just stopping in, please like and subscribe.
The question is as follows. Mr. Lamoureux, seconded by Ms. Lapointe, move that the House do now proceed to orders of the day. La période.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Miss Scroll.
Miss Scroll.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Miss Qualtrough.
Miss Qualtrough.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Miss Jazik.
Miss Jazik.
Miss O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Monsieur Lamoureux.
Monsieur Lamoureux.
Mr. Fragiscaros.
Mr. Fagascados.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Monsieur Elkoury.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Monsieur Yacono.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Miss Vandenbelt.
Miss Vandenbelt.
Miss Latanzio. Correction, Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McLeod.
Mr. McLeod.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. McCullough, Edmonton West.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Van Pupta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cran.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Madame Normandin.
Madame Normandin.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Monsieur Lemire.
Monsieur Lemire.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Bérubé.
Madame Bérubé.
Monsieur Désilet.
Monsieur Désilet.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la période.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function or rise and the chair will recognize them.
I vote yes.
Ms. Ashton, yea pour.
l'honorable député de Mégantic-L'Érable.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I would like you to verify the picture of the member for Papineau. We can't see the face of the member for Papineau. I'd like for you to verify with the table.
Alors, je ne sais pas si...
So I don't know if the honorable member for Papineau is online right now. If not, his vote doesn't count.
C'est bon?
Okay,
Parfait.
great.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 176, 176. Nays contre, 147, 147.
I declare the motion carried. I have a point of order. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The decision of the government to proceed to the orders of the day prevents the presentation of private members' bills. I have an important private members' bill on Ukraine and munitions. I wonder if there be unanimous consent to allow members of all parties, if they have private members' bills, to table them now.
I already hear no. I'm assuming that he hadn't. Order. Order. I just want to remind members that maybe they want to have a conversation with other members ahead of time to ask for unanimous consent, and then that way they'll be more successful in their attempt. C'est bon? Orders of the day, ordre du jour.
Ordre émanant du gouvernement.
Government orders, Ways and Means, number 24, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on April 16, 2024.
I want to remind members that the House is in session. If they wish to have conversation, to please take them out because I have trouble hearing what's going on. Thank you. Monsieur Guilbeault pour...
Mr. Guilbeault for Ms. Freeland, seconded by Ms. Martinez-Ferrada, moves that a Ways and Means motion to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Implement Certain Provisions of the Budget tabled in Parliament on April 16, 2024 be concurred in.
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker, we request a recorded vote, please.
Call in the members.
Wow, seriously, they're gonna do this again all day? This is effing liberal pieces of crap that just waste. All they're doing is wasting the day. Yeah, this is what your House of Commons does. They call for votes and waste time. That'll be literally an hour of the day wasted on just vote calls. Like, absolutely 2 vote calls of that. Probably longer if you take in the actual vote itself. It's ridiculous. Oh, you want to know how much your cost is per hour? It is $85,000 an hour to have this place run. So they just wasted over $85,000 just on vote calls. No, it's not the money that the MPs are paid. It's the house, how much it costs to have the house operate is $85,000 an hour. That's interpreters. That's the technical team in the background that are doing all the IT work. That's the people controlling the cameras, everything. It is $85,000 to operate the House of Commons per hour, not including MPs. If it's MPs, then it's millions.
I hear some creaking there? The question is as follows. Mr. Guilbeault for Madame Freeland, seconded by Ms. Martinez-Ferrada, moves that a Ways and Means motion be introduced, a bill entitled an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on April 16, 2024, be concurred in. La période de 10 minutes.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Monsieur Guilbeault. Mr. McKay. Mr. McKay. Ms. Groh. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Madame Martinez-Ferrada. Madame Martinez-Ferrada. Miss O'Connell. Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Lamoureux. Mr. Lamoureux. Mr. Fragiscaros. Mr. Fragiscaros. Mr. Kuzmarchuk. Mr. Kuzmarchuk. Monsieur El Khoury. Monsieur El Khoury. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hardy. Mr. Sarai. Mr. Sarai. Miss Vandenbelt. Ms. Vandenbelt. Madame Koutrakis. Madame Koutrakis. Monsieur Lightbound. Monsieur Lightbound. Mr. McDonald-Avalon. Mr. McDonald-Avalon. Mr. McLeod. Mr. McLeod. Monsieur Robillard. Monsieur Robillard. Miss Hefner. Ms. Hefner. Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang. Mrs. Zaid. Mrs. Zaid. Miss Yip. Miss Yip. Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali. Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek. Mr. Collins, Hamilton East, Stony Creek. Madame Lapointe. Madame Lapointe. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey. Miss Kwan. Miss Kwan. Miss McPherson. Miss McPherson. Madame Hughes. Madame Hughes. Mr. Cannings. Mr. Cannings. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett. Mrs. Gray. Mrs. Gray. Mr. Barlow. Mr. Barlow. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore. Mr. Ellis. Mr. Ellis. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Brock. Mr. Brock. Monsieur Berthold. Monsieur Berthold. Mrs. Cousy. Mrs. Cousy. Mr. Seaback. Mr. Seaback. Mrs. Block. Mrs. Block. Mr. Viss. Mr. Viss. Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West. Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West. Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd. Monsieur Brassard. Monsieur Brassard. Mrs. Goodridge. Mrs. Goodridge. Mr. Caputo. Mr. Caputo. Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Robert. Mr. Patzer. Mr. Patzer. Mrs. Gallant. Mrs. Gallant. Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse. Mr. Redekop. Mr. Redekop. Mr. Van Pupta. Mr. Van Pupta. Mr. Waugh. Mr. Waugh. Mr. Steinley. Mr. Steinley. Monsieur Leroux. Monsieur Leroux. Mr. Lobb. Mr. Lobb. Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Zimmer. Mr. Kitchen. Mr. Kitchen. Mr. Cram. Mr. Cram. Mr. Shields. Mr. Shields. Mr. Falk Provencher. Mr. Falk Provencher. Mr. Motts. Mr. Motts. Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold. Mr. Carey. Mr. Carey. Madame Normandin. Madame Normandin. Madame de Bellefeuille. Madame de Bellefeuille. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay. Monsieur Lemire. Monsieur Lemire. Madame Desbiens. Madame Desbiens. Madame Bérubé. Madame Bérubé. Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands. Miss May, Saanich Gulf Islands. Mr. Morris. Mr. Morris.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
that the electronic voting period has ended. If ces députés n'ont pas pu voter,
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Madame Ashton.
I would like to vote yes.
Quelqu'un d'autre qui a eu des problèmes?
Anyone else with technical difficulties?
Le bureau.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Mr. Speaker?
I see the Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Yeah, but I'll do adjournment.
Does it sound like the proper mic, Speaker?
So we see him with the hand thumbs up, okay? And I see also Mr.
Mr. Speaker?
Yep, we've got you. C'est bon. Okay, and we have also Mr. Miller. Minister Miller? Non, c'est lui sur la mauvaise.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be registered as yay.
All right, your vote is recorded. Merci beaucoup. Okay, again, the table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 176, 176. Nays contre 150, 150.
I declare the motion carried. Monsieur Guilbeault for Madame Freeland, second. Madame Martinez Ferrada moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Implement Certain Provisions of the Budget tabled in Parliament on April 16, 2024. This motion is deemed adopted. Monsieur Guilbeault pour Madame Freeland, appuyé par Madame Martinez Ferrada, propose.
Moves that this bill be now read a first time and printed. This motion is deemed to be adopted.
This bill be read a second time. When shall this bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House. Now we have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising on a point of privilege that was raised by the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, on Monday. He and I and my honourable colleague here belong to a group called IPAC, and it's a international interparliamentary group alliance on China. And it appears that we've attracted some unwanted attention. So last Wednesday, he and I were on a call with IPAC in London, and we were advised of this form of cyber attack, which I'm in a stage, an agent stage, where I don't pretend to understand exactly what they were talking about. But I'm given to understand that a group called APT-31, Advanced Persistent Threat 31, was conducting cyber attacks against some colleagues here and indeed around the world. And the only reason that we found out about it was that the FBI was conducting a surveillance operation and a couple of years ago, and we were caught up in that surveillance operation. So that's a couple of years ago. So the question becomes, well, how come we didn't know about it? So IPAC contacted the U.S. Department of Justice, and they asked how come we didn't know about it. Well, the U.S. Department of Justice did notify the relevant nations, sovereignty to sovereignty. So IPAC then compared the FBI lists with their own lists, and the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, myself, and my colleague here were on that list. So the question becomes, well, why didn't we know about it? So Since then, we've been advised that the FBI did notify the Canada Security Establishment, CSE. And CSE, in turn, notified Parliament, or the IT service that runs Parliament. And they did run a security check in a timely sort of fashion. And the good news is that the system that we have here was not breached. So in that respect, it worked. However, there is an issue. At that point, the decision was made to not notify the affected members of Parliament and senators. I think there's about 13 of us in total. And that is a bit more problematic. And so this is why I support the member privilege motion, because I do think that this needs to be investigated. Now, I'm given to understand, Madam Speaker, that there are literally hundreds of thousands of attacks on our IT system on a daily basis. Literally a massive volume. And it becomes difficult to know when attacks are unsuccessful, whether, when, and how, and if members should be notified. Because literally, our inboxes could be filled on a daily basis with notifications of attacks. Yet on the other hand, Madam Speaker, if I, as a member who's interested in security matters and defense matters, have an unusual volume of attacks, or other members for other reasons have an unusual volume or pattern of attacks, then that seems to be quite relevant to the interests of those individual members. So the reason I'm supporting the honourable member's privilege motion is that we need to start to review these protocols and do it sooner rather than later. And I want to make the point that this is not a government issue. This is a Parliament issue. The government did its job, so to speak, as CSE reported it to our security services and the people that run it. But I believe, Madam Speaker, that PROC does need to look at this, needs to review the sequence of events to make sure that, as I'm describing it to the House, it is correct, to describe to examine the decisions that were made when the information became available to Canadian authorities, and to review whether this is the kind of information that should be shared with members, and if so, in what format, how frequent, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that I don't think that we can take very lightly, Madam Speaker. The analogy I've drawn in the past has been, it's like somebody looking at your mail in the post office. And I think all of us would be pretty upset with somebody examining our mail in the post office. It's a bit of an exaggeration to say that, but having said that, it does give you the sense in which the emails that are coming into all of our offices, and these are significant volumes, we need to have not only a security for ourselves, but our security for our correspondents and the security for our constituents. So, Madam Speaker, I just want to raise this point of privilege. I do believe it is a point of privilege. I hope that the Speaker does find it to be a point of privilege, and that he will ask the member from Fort Saskatchewan, or Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, to move the relevant motion. So thank you, Madam Speaker, for your time and attention. This is, as I say, a significant issue, and I do believe that this chamber and hopefully ultimately PROC needs to deal with this in a timely sort of way. So thank you.
Another point of order, the honourable for Battle River, Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you, Speaker. I will be brief. I just want to add my comments to both of my colleagues who are the co-chairs for Canada on the IPAC organization. I don't believe it ends there. I want to see this go forward so that if these attacks are happening and yes, it's great that the firewall held and nothing was penetrated, but I think as members of Parliament we need to be briefed better than what we currently are, and if anything is an over and abundance of attacks for some particular reason on my system, I would like to know that. And I appreciate the fact that it was firewall held up, but it's a question of where do we go from here? And if we're getting thousands and thousands of attacks every day, I think all of us as parliamentarians need to be more aware of it, make sure that we are doing what we need to protect ourselves. But I also think that the parliamentarians who are under surveillance from various areas need to know that so that we ensure that we are protecting ourselves. I don't think it should change the fact that many of us stand up on files on human rights issues that we care about, and I would not want to see intimidation be a factor in stopping us from doing our jobs. But I do believe that the more information we have, the better informed we are, and the better we are able to protect ourselves and our citizens. So, thank you, Madam Speaker.
I do appreciate the honourable members' interventions. Certainly we'll take that under consideration as we deliberate on bringing back a statement on this. Orders of the day, ordre du jour.
Government orders, government bills, comments, consideration at report stage of Bill C-49, an act to amend the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act and the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make consequential amendments to other acts.
There are 9 motions in amendment standing on the notice paper for the report stage of Bill C-49.
Motions number 1 to 9 will not be chosen by the Speaker because they could have been presented at committee. There being no motion at report stage, the House will now proceed without debate to the putting of the question on the motion to concur in the bill at report stage.
Regan for Mr. Wilkinson, seconded by Ms. Kira, moves that Bill C-49, an act to amend the Canada, Newfoundland and Labrador Atlantic Accord Implementation Act and the Canada, Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Resources Accord Implementation Act, and to make the consequential amendments to other acts as amended be concurred in at report stage.
If a member participating in person wishes that the motion be carried or carried on division, or if a member of a recognized party.
Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Madam Speaker, we're prepared to just have it pass on division.
The honourable member for Banff Airdrie.
Vote.
And the members.
All right, guys. Well, obviously this is ridiculous. I'm going to end it here. I'll be back on for question period. There's no point in sitting here streaming, 2 to 3 hours worth of vote calls. So I'm going to close down the stream. I will be back on, obviously, in time for question period, and we'll go from there. All right. We'll see you in a little bit.